You're listening to episode 40 of the Dissect and Connect podcast. Today's episode focuses on grief and bereavement. However, as a warning of potential triggers for some of our listeners, please note that this discussion also includes conversation about both suicide and overdose. Hello and welcome to the Dissect and Connect podcast. I'm your host, Mike Wade. This is the podcast where we explore population health issues impacting your community. Dissect and Connect is a service of New River Valley Community Services and the Montgomery County Prevention Partners. Katherine Allen is a professor emerita with the Department of Human Development and Family Science at Virginia Tech. She studies family diversity over the life course. A bereaved parent, Katherine lost her son Matt in 2011 and now works with other parents on their journeys of healing and recovery from loss. Lisa Evanylo is the administrator of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Blacksburg. She lost her 28-year-old son Dylan in 2013 following his long battle with the disease of addiction. Lisa had previously spent 5 years in Al-Anon and values the support that only others who are enduring the same struggle can provide. She hopes to be a source of comfort and healing to other bereaved parents. So, Katherine and Lisa, welcome to the Dissect and Connect podcast.
Thank you, Mike. We are very grateful to be here. We really appreciate how you advertise our group through the New River Valley Community Services, and we appreciate all the work that you're doing.
Well, we are happy to help in any way that we can, and I certainly appreciate both of you taking time to chat with me today. Before the interview started, I shared your stories, a snip of your stories with our listeners, but I wanted to maybe dive in and talk a little bit more about what led you all to this point to develop the group for our community, and just talk a little bit more about your personal story. So, Lisa, if you wouldn't mind, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, my son's Dylan, his slide into drug addiction began when he was 17 and tore his ACL playing soccer for Blacksburg High School and wound up having reconstructive surgery. And afterwards, began to rely too much on the Percocets that he was given for pain, and look back and realize something crucial that we missed when he said that the Percocets not only relieve his physical pain, but they relieve his emotional pain. And I think at that point, he began using opiates as often as he could. And we didn't realize that he was bipolar at that point. And he seemed to be struggling with depression afterwards, but we thought it was just because he lost his life, which was soccer. That was his whole life. So he really struggled, but kind of never, we kept telling him that another door, when one door closes, another door opens, but he just never was able to find that other door. And so he just struggled and turned to drugs, which he said were the only thing that made him feel normal, even though we had brought him to a psychiatrist. He was on medication, but the illegal drugs helped him more. So he spent, that was when he was 17. So for the next many, many years, he had several severe overdoses, one in which his heart stopped 5 times, and we didn't think he would survive, but he did. And so he was pretty much in and out of rehab, halfway houses, several more overdoses. And then he was living in Florida, and in July of 2013, he overdosed. And we were actually on vacation with our other son, and so didn't find out till we got home the following night. And so I will say it was not a surprise knowing how many times he had overdosed and the struggle he was having. So I struggled for many, many years with guilt. And I did go to Al-Anon for 5 years, and the biggest thing I worked on was my guilt, because I just felt like if I had been a different parent to him, that maybe this wouldn't have happened. But I don't know that, so I really struggle with that, and I still do at times.
Sure.
And so it's when Katherine came to me and asked me if I would be interested in starting this parents group, I thought it was a wonderful idea. And I know a lot of mothers, when their child dies of a drug overdose, they kind of become activists in anti-drug campaigns and go around talking to youth groups and things like that about not doing drugs, and they talk from their personal experience. But I just didn't have that in me. And so when Katherine suggested this group, I just felt like this is something I can do to help others with, like, turn my pain into good somehow. And I think the same as when I was in the Al-Anon meetings, people would come in and say, this is the first place I can actually talk to people who know what I'm talking about, because they're struggling with the same issues. I think our parents group, which interestingly is all women, people come in and just say, this is the first group I found of people that I can talk to, because only other parents know what it's like to lose a child. And so, so it's been wonderful, and it's very healing. And even though we only meet once a month, it sustains us, I think, till the next month. And over the holidays, as people are struggling, we are having, for the first time in 2 years, an extra meeting for anybody who just feels they need to come on and voice their sorrow.
Well, I definitely want to make sure that we promote that. And Lisa, thank you so much for sharing that. And sadly, as you well know, Dylan's story is not unique. I mean, that's a very common story that we hear with folks who struggle with addiction and unfortunately often succumb to that disease. So, Katherine, let's talk about your story.
Well, my son, Matthew, was 23 and a half, and he, at about 3:30 in the morning on January 4th, 2011, so it's been almost, the 10-year anniversary is coming up, he took his own life. My son died by suicide, and he jumped from the Radford Bridge. And so I find it very hard to go to Radford now. I read the letter that he left. He left it to his partner. They had broken up. And it was his despondency, his heartbreak. It was the witching hour. I mean, 3 to 4 in the morning is the darkest, time of the night. And it was the coldest day of the year. I mean, that's why the holidays are so depressing for many people, because it's a cold time.
Right.
We're cold, and he had, in my family, there's a lot of depression. There's a lot of alcoholism, mental health issues. I am a professional in the human development and family science, but I just retired. But I spent my whole career teaching things like families and addiction and marriage and family relationships. I have been in therapy since I was 19 and believe in it. I've trained therapists. I've worked with therapists. I believe in it. Matthew understood that there was a family history of addiction, a family history of mental health problems. And he finally had come to me and said, I think I have a problem. I'm ready to talk to someone. I always offered therapy, always. And I know great therapists in town. And he lived in Radford with, college friends. And he had a great job. He was a computer scientist. He was creating educational video games. And he's he was doing very well academically and in his career choice, young, of course. But I think the heartache and the stress, he didn't take well to stress. I think stress is just a silent killer.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a lot of anxiety. He wasn't on medication, but he was saying maybe it's time. He didn't give himself the chance. And so he was at my home on I think it was Sunday evening, always came over to do his laundry. We made dinner for him.
Mm-hmm.
We were looking at a computer, on the computer, and he was telling me about who he calls his people, they're technology people. We were laughing. I mean, it was a beautiful time. But of course, we know about suicide. People have already decided. I believe he had already decided, and that this was his time. Game over, as he would say. He was a video gamer, and I have an art project that he created just with his hand, using his hands. And at the end, it says game over. And I sometimes think of that this precious, brilliant, beautiful child had only 23 and a half years on this earth. And he chose to end his life. That is a very hard thing for a parent to say, but it was his choice. I have spent all of this time dealing with it, raking myself over the coals. I have a relatively checkered marital history. I have been divorced twice. I'm in a third marriage now. Wasn't my fault. How was it my fault? Every parent who loses a child in any way has to deal with this. And I understand it was not my fault, just like what happened to Lisa was not her fault.
Mm-hmm.
We loved these beautiful children with all our heart, and life got to them. So we're sadder but wiser, I think, about that. But, I understand that Matthew made a choice. It was, many people would say, an impetuous choice, an impulsive choice. I do not understand suicide. I don't understand why he chose that method, but he did. And the saddest thing about it is that those of us who are left have to deal with the emotional pain of how could I have saved him? And what do I do now? But my son, and then in starting the parent, and it took me a long time. We didn't start the group until 8 years after Matt's death. And it took me a long time to know what I did not rush into anything. I had my private therapy. I went to a group. Also, I went to a grief therapist. I read a jillion books. I worked through a lot of feelings, and it came to me that I am a resilient person, and I will not let my child's death define my child's life. My child was a wonderful person. And this group, I think all the it is, as Lisa said, it's moms. We have had one dad, but mostly it's moms. That's a gender issue in our society. Men aren't really allowed to grieve. And women are burdened with having to do the grieving for everybody in the family. Mm-hmm. So we found each other. We started slow. We started small, but there's 25 people on our listserv. But at our meetings, we have maybe 3 to 9. Sometimes it's very small, and sometimes it's, like last meeting was 8. The time before that was 9. And it is the most healing hour, aside from my private therapy. It is the most healing hour of the month. Just we sit. We were now on Zoom. Each woman shares, each person shares, and we lift each other up. Nobody tries to fix anybody. Nobody tries to tell, you'll get over it. We'll go through all the things you should not say to a grieving parent.
Great.
Never say he's in a better place or, God called him home. We don't understand why our children are gone. Mm-hmm. We don't know. We don't get it. And there's no reason for it. And it's not anybody's fault.
Well, death can be difficult to accept even with
Yes.
people who have lived 80, 90 years. I mean, elderly that die of natural causes, sometimes it's very difficult to accept. To think about young people in the primes of their lives like Dylan and Matt, I mean, I just can't even fathom that.
It's hard. Go ahead, Lisa. Sorry.
I feel like I spent a long time in denial, and it was a way of coping for me, just not to feel so much. And I think this group has brought out a lot of my feelings, and I find myself saying things in our group meetings that I almost surprise myself that this is how I feel, and it comes out, and it's wonderful because I am able to express it, and that just helps me with realizing what I'm going through, and I feel like my denial has been decreasing, and I'm able to talk about it more.
I suppose the denial, at least at some point, was a defense mechanism for you.
Yeah, well, if you don't accept it, you don't feel the pain as deeply, and you just, after he died, the phone would ring, and I kept thinking, oh, that's him calling me. And that continued for about 6 months. Like, you keep thinking it's just a mistake and this didn't really happen. And I think, that's just your way of coping for a while. And so,
That's good. That's true. Another feeling, the feelings are, I'm so happy you said that, Lisa, because it is this raw expression of our feelings. We live in a culture that doesn't acknowledge grief, that wants you to just be quiet about it. People will rush by you in the grocery store so they don't have to see you. And so to have a space of people who can say, I am sad, I am guilty, I am ashamed, I am angry, I am exhausted, to say these things, and we all just start shaking our heads and smiling and laughing, and it's like, finally, somebody is getting it. So it's very good to have a place where we can let the feelings out, and to hold each other up. It isn't just, people aren't complaining. It's not like that. It's not a complaint session. It is, this is my reality. Everything has changed. And so we have to rebuild life. We have to rebuild our lives.
So, Katherine, you lost your son to suicide. Lisa, your son died from an overdose. Those issues, sadly, are still very stigmatized in our society. Can you talk about having to grapple with grief in addition to causes of death that are still very much judged and scrutinized by members of our society?
Yes, I would like to say a few things about that. First of all, one of my very first reactions, because you're in complete shock, right? When I first got the call from the police officer, it was probably about 4:30 in the morning, and I wear glasses, and I knocked him off my bedstand, and I was crawling around on the floor trying to find him, trying to hear him say, come to the hospital. I mean, just the disorientation, the shock, the disbelief. It lasted for me at least 2 years. That feeling of out of body, out of mind experience. And so time has helped more than anything. And I can now face that one of my early feelings was, oh my God, this is the most shameful thing that can happen to a mother. She can lose her child by suicide, death by suicide. And I felt that I would be a pariah in my community. So I'm just sharing that reaction. I was aware of that visceral reaction that I am a failed mother and I am a nothing now. And I have had to build back a life from that feeling of being squashed. And I have come, at Lisa and I talk about this all the time. And I love Lisa from when she shares the pictures of her baby bouncing on her lap. And we remember the beautiful children we have. And again, my son's life was, I am not going to let the death define it. Okay? So yes, the stigma is there. It is so intense. And can you imagine watching, every time you watch TV, somebody says, oh, I'm just going to jump off a bridge, or, they make jokes. It's
Yep.
suicide and jumping off of bridges and blowing your brains out. Those are all things people say to make light of something difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It is a stab wound to the heart. It hurts deeply for bereaved parents to hear that, anybody to hear that. So yes, we are a society that doesn't understand it. We have, and there's no context for it. Okay. But one last thing I will say, we are not the only types of death. We, in our bereaved parents group, we have children who have died by laying on train tracks. We have children who have been killed in accidents that someone else was driving, and it was an accident.
Mm-hmm.
We have children who've died by heart attacks. The mother's grief, the father's grief, the parents' grief, the grandparents' grief is just as deep, no matter how your child dies. Okay, it's, maybe your child died by natural causes. It's never natural if it's your child, but by non-stigmatized causes. But the parents' grief is still beyond something you can imagine. Lisa, what were we going to say?
Well, I unfortunately was one of those people, because we have no addictions in my family or my husband's family. And so I just really was very ignorant about it. And so when my son started dealing with addiction, I was one of those who looked at it as a moral problem. Like, as a parent, I didn't teach him the proper morals. As a person, he had no morals. And so I looked, yes, there was lots and lots of shame associated with that. And it was just, how could in my family something like this happen? And when he had his major overdose and he went to a rehab facility in North Carolina, we went down, my husband and I went down for like a 4-day family time. And that was where I learned all about addiction and the different chemical reactions in brains and why some people get addicted and others don't. And it opened my eyes. But there's a real conflict with dealing with a child with addiction, because you're told by the therapist, don't enable, don't let them do this if they're on the streets and homeless, don't send them a dime, they've got to hit rock bottom. But yet, your child, because so many people with addictions also have mental health issues, you're dealing with a child who's got an illness, and they always say, if your child had cancer, would you just say, well, sorry, we're kicking you out of the house? No, you would want to treat them. So you're tormented on how much do I help and how much do I follow what the therapists say, of saying, I'm sorry, I'm not helping you. So it's extremely stressful, and we were tormented over what to do. And a very hard part for us was my son would call just sobbing on the phone, how he was so sorry that, he had this great family and we gave him a great life. And what did he do with it but become a junkie? And he used to just sob and break my heart. And then another thing he said was the hardest part for him was that he ruined our lives. And he did. But we didn't want to lay the guilt on him, so we would tell him no. But, we spent like 8 or 9 years not sleeping, totally stressed out all the time. And it was almost, when he died, it was, I think I mentioned, we just figured, we kind of expected it or had the feeling it might happen someday, but it's still like a jolt when it finally does happen. And, but for us, I would say in some ways, it was almost less stressful because we felt that hopefully he was out of his intense suffering. And so it was almost a little bit of a relief that he was no longer suffering. And one thing that did help me was after he died, several of his friends from Florida that he knew, like in rehab and halfway houses, called me and just told me what a wonderful person he was, which really, and that he was funny and he was so helpful to other people struggling with addiction, and what compassion he had. So that really helped me. And I spend some time, I'm still on it, but I don't look at it as much. It's a Facebook group called Grasp, and it's grief recovery after substance passing. And so people, when I first joined it in 2013, there were maybe 1,100 people on it. There are thousands on it now. And it just breaks my heart that, addiction just keeps claiming more and more lives. And people post pictures of their loved ones. And they're just these, whether they're young or old or whatever, just such, beautiful people. And they'll post a picture of them as a baby, a young child. And, it's just heartbreaking that they grow up and this is what happens with their lives. But on this page, a lot of people, when I was posting way back when, in 2013 and 14 maybe, a lot of people, and my son included, talked about that their children who became addicted, there were certain personality traits, and Mike, I don't know if you find this, but they're very sensitive children, they're very compassionate, and they're very creative, and very bubbly and outgoing, and often can light up a room with their beautiful personalities. So, and when someone would write that, so many other people would say, oh my gosh, that's my child. And so I think they're just, I see my son was so sensitive that I think just life was harder on him because it was more of a struggle to deal with how sensitive he was to things.
Katherine, I know you mentioned some of the things that grieving parents can do in the aftermath of a loss. Can you talk a little bit more about those?
Yes, thank you for that question, Mike. Just some of the basics. There are no rules. Most of us feel we are making things up as we go along. There's no roadmap. Be kind to yourself. The parent feels responsible. And especially mothers. Mothers are to blame for everything in this society. And then fathers are ignored. And then what about step parents? What about step parents are, there's a lot of invisible people here. Grandparents, cousins, siblings, best friends. So we all have to be kinder to ourselves. Find community. No one gets it like another bereaved parent. That's what we have. That has been the silver lining in all of this, just a community of people who were speaking a private language. Other people don't get it. It's almost like we're speaking in our own language when we talk about what's happened to us. Develop rituals to remember your child. For example, I started a foundation account from the Community Foundation of the New River Valley in Matthew Allen Special's name. And it's for the purpose of mental health and social justice. These are my causes. These were his causes. And I just got a bench on the Huckleberry Trail in his honor. So I'm excited to have these things, and that the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, I have his ashes in a columbarium there. So when people come from out of town, they can go and put their fingers on his name. So, have places like that. Of course it's my field, but I'm a firm believer in seeing a therapist. That's who's really helped me, and other helping professionals. Having a friend or family member truly acknowledge your pain. Too many people want to try to fix us. They want to tell us to get over it. Haven't you moved on yet? No, I'm never moving on. This was my precious baby. I am never moving on. So just having someone listen and hear it and not melt away or dissolve because you're expressing so much pain. Okay? That's hard. You'd be surprised how people can't handle it. They can't listen to it. And then, of course, be active. Take a walk, join a group. Good Sam Hospice, they've had so many groups. I went to a collage making class there, and it was with other bereaved people, and it was wonderful. So there's a lot of fabulous things in the community to help. So those are just a few thoughts. Lisa, did you have?
Yeah, one thing that I saw on this GRASP website or Facebook page, when parents lose a child to drugs, as Katherine said, mothers grieve differently than fathers. And the father, unfortunately, a lot of the men don't want to talk about it. They go back to work and they want to act like it never happened. And the mothers are just, having a hard time moving on with their lives, getting out of bed, just functioning. And it seemed that a lot of the marriages break up shortly after losing a child. And I assume that's in other situations, not just losing your child to a drug overdose. And so my husband and I, we just made a decision that we were not going to blame each other. We each had guilt in our own way, but we never said to the other person, if only you had done this differently, he would still be alive. And so I feel our marriage thrived and we were there to support each other. And so, losing a child and then losing your spouse within a year or so is a double blow. So I think it's important that you may think the other person did something wrong, but try to change your thinking and realize that both parents did the best they could and mistakes were made. Maybe they weren't made, but not to blame each other. And we also donated a bench. Ours is at the Unitarian Universalist congregation on their meditation path.
Yes.
And so we did bury some of his ashes under the bench.
Yes.
And we go there on anniversaries of his death, sometimes on his birthday. And we go there and just sit there. And since we didn't have like a grave, or anything like that. So for us, that's where he is. And so we go sit on his bench, and it was especially meaningful because we used to live across the street from where his bench is. And when he was a child, the property was now owned by the church, but at the time it was owned by a family, and my children used to go over there and play. And so it was just a real special place to them. And now, it's a special place to us because that's where he is for us. And so, anyway, so we go there and feel him and talk to him a bit. Oh, and there's another woman in our group. I don't remember what you would call it, but she and her husband have a business where they create structures. I don't know, for a different company.
For amusement parks,
Yeah, for amusement parks. And they, in a park near their house, created a little structure that on top has a house that is a library.
Yeah.
And they put books in there, and it's, put books in here, take books, it's all free, and it's dedicated, it's there in their son's name.
Yes.
And so for them, that's where he lives on. And so, and she showed pictures. We have a Facebook group for our parent group, and not everybody's on it. We have about 9 or 10 people who are on it, but they do post, and particularly when something strikes them, or they're having a tough day, or something beautiful, they see. A lot of people in our group see butterflies or cardinals or some sort of want beautiful wildlife or animals that remind them of their child, and they feel like it's their child speaking to them. Mm-hmm. And so they will post that on the Facebook site and people respond. Or if they're having a bad day, they might post something. And people are very compassionate and respond, which I think in very helpful ways.
So, Katherine, you had talked about things to not say to to parents who are grieving. Can you go over some of those for us?
Yes, I just say a few things. He's in a better place. Everything happens for a reason. You're stronger than you think. This is all part of God's plan. Why don't you just adopt another child? So we could go on and on, but they all sound like nice things to say, but people say them because they're thinking of their own discomfort. They're not thinking of the pain that you're in.
That's an important point.
Yes. And so we try to educate people about that.
So rather than saying those things, what are things that people can say to provide comfort or to acknowledge the passing of a child in a more appropriate way, I should say?
That's such a good thing. That's such a good question. I think the most important thing is active listening and being willing to open up. And if you ask someone, how are you? You don't have to say it with the worst pity in your eyes, like you poor pathetic thing. Just, I'm thinking of you. How are you? And allow the person to share what they're feeling. Often and it's going to come out really confused and muddled because we often don't know what we're feeling. We're feeling everything. So being a supportive listener is very important. Another thing is not asking questions like, well, how did he do it? I mean, one of the most painful experiences I had was I saw someone out in the community and he said, I heard Matthew died. And I said, yes. And I was hoping to get, I'm so sorry, or I feel your pain. And it said, how did he do it? In this kind of like, tell me the gory details. And so that, I just think we have to be careful about, when we're talking with someone, we're in relationship to them. So put yourself in their position. Anyway, I think that's very important. And as the holidays are coming up, it's especially important because we can't reach out and give a hug. This is the time of COVID. We're not seeing people. We can't touch them. We can't give them a kiss. We can't embrace them. Sometimes people just want a hug. One time I called a friend of mine up and I said, I am beside myself. I don't know what to do. She came to my house with 10 different candy bars. I sat there and I hate to say this, I hate everyone. And it really helped. So sometimes it's just the most outrageous thing that can just help you get out of yourself in that moment.
Well, I'm glad. Well, I mean, you got to do what you got to do.
Yeah, I know. It really helped. I'm really, I have to watch it now because I'm, have some issues with that. But
I'm glad
not that I didn't need a lecture. Right. I needed something comforting.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. I'm glad you mentioned COVID and the challenges that's brought with just trying to connect with each other, and particularly for people who are grieving. And let's face it, a lot of people are in that position over the past 8-9 months because of COVID-19. So words of wisdom to maybe share with families who are maybe struggling with losing someone or not being able to feel supported during the holidays or just in general?
Well, I would say, like Lisa mentioned, for our group, we are having, we don't want to burn ourselves out. We recognize that anytime you talk about grief, it's exhausting.
Yeah.
But we have several people in our group that are single. Their other child, they have no other children, or their other child isn't available. And the child that died would have been the one that would have spent the holiday with them. And so we are having another group on Zoom, and things like Zoom actually can help because we've opened it up. People have heard about us. We have a member from Florida. We have a member from Maryland. We have people from Smith Mountain Lake.
That's great.
So people have found us on Zoom from kind of all over. And in that sense, so we're impromptu. We're creating this meeting to accommodate folks like that. I think it's very important to send, if you can, to send cards. You know, especially for older generations, we are the card generation. We like to, so that is another way of reaching out. We have a member in our group who likes to receive, we all feel differently about this, but she likes to receive a birthday card on her son's birthday. Others don't want that. That might not be what they want. So it's kind of knowing, being sensitive enough to make the gesture that what would soothe the other person's pain.
I just want to add one thing that helps us, and this is not with the meeting, but is having friends who we can talk about our son to. And, you know, he was a part of our life for 28 years, and we don't want to not talk about him because people are uncomfortable because they don't know how to react. And so we have friends that, you know, we just talk about, oh, when our children were young, or Dylan did this, or Dylan did that. And they are, as Katherine said, you need someone to listen, and they just listen, and they might ask a question, and they don't have a look of, oh, I wish you would stop talking about that child because we're uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And so that has really helped us, having people that we can talk to and accept that we will talk about our son.
Yes.
And I wanted to bring up another thing that it's very difficult for parents who have lost a child. And I know we talk about it in our group, and a lot of people have this issue, is when you go somewhere and you meet somebody that you haven't seen for years, and your children knew each other, maybe in high school or something like that, and they, you know, they'll ask you, how's your child? And it's just hard, you know, if you're in a party setting to say, oh, my child passed away. And then, you know, you might be in a group where someone is talking about their children, and it's like, oh, my son's a doctor, and my son just got a PhD, and I have 15 grandchildren, and you feel very small compared, you know, thinking about all their family has achieved, and you've lost your child. You know, especially I think if it's been drug addiction or suicide.
Yeah.
It's harder.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then also when you go somewhere and you meet someone you don't know previously, like a hairdresser or someone you meet new, and they say, oh, so how many children do you have? It's also, you don't want to, in a setting where you don't even know this person, you don't want to be burdening them with your loss, but you also don't want to not acknowledge that you have this child. And so I find that very difficult. You know, if I say two, and they go, oh, what do your children do? So you have to say one passed away, but I don't want to tell this person that because I don't know them. But you don't want to say, I just have one, because you do have two, or one, or, you know, five, whatever you have.
Are there resources beyond the group that you all host? Are there websites or books that you might recommend to our listeners?
Yes, definitely. There are so many. There are an endless supply. There's just so many. There's a national bereaved parent, and it's in Canada too. Bereaved Parents Association. There's Compassionate Friends. I'm sure you know about. That's for people of grieving of any type. But I would say our group serves the purpose because we're talking about an adolescent or to adult child.
Right.
And when you go to grief groups, whether it's a spousal loss or, you know, it's someone had a long illness, that's a very different type of grief.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we all have there's, grief is a process, but the reason for your grief really makes a difference. And many of us, if you've lost a child to suicide or drug addiction, you are experiencing probably PTSD. You're experiencing complicated grief because it's outside. Complicated grief is anything outside the normal realm, right? Normal, quote unquote,
right?
Meaning that you expect, if you're 90 years old, you expect your spouse will not, you may not be around for much longer. One other thing I wanted to mention, one of the great unexamined pieces of grief is so many of us experienced multiple deaths in a short period of time. For example, a woman lost her 25-year-old daughter, her mother, and her father within a few months. I lost my mother, my son, my sister-in-law, and my best friend within 2 years.
Wow.
So a lot of people in our group have experienced this compounded grief, and that's an issue that people need to be more sensitive to.
Is there a book that maybe stands out as being helpful?
So I'll recommend this two right here.
Okay.
One is by Megan Devine. We could recommend anything. Oh, you can't see it. Megan Devine. It's called "It's Okay That You're Not Okay: Meeting Grief and Loss in a Culture That Doesn't Understand." She lost her husband. She's a young woman, so she writes about that. We've also talked about Tear Soup, which is a children's story, and many of us have read that. There's a Judy Teitelbaum wrote, it's a little bit older, but it's a very good book called The Courage to Grieve, The Classic Guide to Creative Living, Recovery, and Growth Through Grief. And the classic book on suicide loss is called My Son, My Son. And that has been around for a long time. I first read that. Someone sent it to me immediately, and I read that, and it was just like putting a soothing lotion on my skin. I was so uncomfortable. No one could comfort me. And that really helped. So there are so many books, and there are more and more, as Lisa said, because, drug addiction, suicide, they're all on the rise. This is happening in our culture, and I will say in our group, it used to just be mothers, and every one of us had lost a son. Now we have some people that they've lost daughters.
Mm-hmm.
So, so death is reaching out across so many experiences.
Sad but true, and we're seeing more of that in light of the pandemic. Not necessarily directly related to COVID-19, but overdoses and suicides do appear to be on the rise. So,
and also there's a lot of daily meditation books that we recommend. That we sometimes buy. Healing After Loss. I think, Lisa, you got one. A daily meditation. Sometimes just having a paragraph helps you.
I have Grief Day by Day.
Yeah.
Written by a woman whose husband died, and she has lots of quotes. And we do start our meetings, Katherine and I, and since both of us usually bring a short reading to the group.
Yeah.
And then Katherine does a fabulous job of leading the reading, and she gets everybody talking.
And Lisa is our Facebook person. She set that up for us. So we're just a great team. And the women and the men, if they wanted to come, but mostly it's been women who have joined us. We stand with each other. And so the power of a small community creating a resource like this.
The group meets the second Monday of each month at 6 p.m. And you're currently meeting via Zoom.
Yes.
We do post the meeting announcements on the NRVCS Facebook page. But I'll also include Katherine and Lisa's contact information in the show notes for today's episode.
Yes.
Ladies, you've both been incredibly generous with your time, and I've so enjoyed our conversation, even though it is a difficult topic. Any parting words of wisdom to share with our listeners before we say goodbye?
I just want to add one more thing about our group, is that we have a list of everybody's name, email, and phone number. And the rule is that anybody who puts their phone number in the list says that they are willing to take calls from anybody else in the group, not 3 a.m. or anything like that, but if someone needs to talk, and certain people may feel more of a connection to one person than another.
Yeah.
So that list is there. So if you are having a bad day and need to talk to someone right away, you can call someone on that list.
Yeah. And we only give it to the people in the group.
Yeah.
Right.
But Lisa and I are out there. We're willing to take calls.
Catherine, any final thoughts from you?
It took a long time for me to feel comfortable in this group. I went every week. Every month. I felt it was a calling to start this. It was very uncomfortable for the first year. I didn't feel that. I felt like it just kept showing up. And sometimes I would feel distressed when I left. But then after about a year of doing it, a shift happened. And it's become a very important part of my life. And it feeds my soul. And it makes me feel like my son is proud of me for doing this. I feel the connection to my son in doing this, and to the other parents and to their children. And I'm there to celebrate those children, even though they are not with us on earth now.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to sum up our conversation, to wrap it up. And again, just thank you both so much for your time today. And hope that we get some more people involved. Hope some of the men out there that are in this situation begin to join you. And I'm just so grateful that this is a resource for people out there. And thank you both for what you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Dissect and Connect is sponsored by Teen Connections, a leadership program through Planned Parenthood South Atlantic that empowers youth with the facts about sexual health and the skills to build stronger, healthier relationships. It's free, totally virtual, and you can earn $100 when you graduate as a Teen Connections peer educator in your community. Join a Teen Connections program from home today. For more information, be sure to check out the show notes from today's episode. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Dissect and Connect podcast. To learn more about Montgomery County Prevention Partners, our New River Valley Community Services, be sure to check us out on Facebook or visit nrvcs.org/podcast.